Welcome back. Please take a seat if you haven't yet. We would like to restart. I'm restarting in the first place in English, just to reiterate. If you need translation from our German chat, which we will start in a second, please tap on translation in the Zoom menu. If you need live captioning, either here in the hall, you can read it there, or you can have it, of course, also online in the settings with subtitles. Wir freuen uns sehr. Wir haben heute schon eine ganze Reihe von Themen diskutiert, unter anderem mit Staatssekretärin Baumann, mit Michael Köhler von DG ECHO. Wir haben eben eine spannende, kontroverse Debatte auch über Vernetzungs- und Integrationsfragen humanitärer Hilfe und andere Aspekte geführt, mit unter anderem Christian Katzer vom MSF und den Kolleginnen, die, glaube ich, auch noch da sind, von GPPI und dem HERE-Geneva. Und wollen jetzt gerne diese Diskussion unter der Fragestellung, braucht es eine humanitäre Zeitenwende, auch in Fragen von Koordination aufnehmen und freuen uns sehr, dass Sie da sind, Frau Potzel. Und wir freuen uns sehr über Ed Schenkenberg von HERE, auch noch vorstellen würden. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass zugeschaltet ist Gareth Price-Jones aus Genf. And we will switch to English, be reassured, Gareth, once we have a chat later on. In der europäischen Zeitenwende-Debatte oder Turning-Point-Debatte in Bezug auf die Krise in der Ukraine gibt es ja großen Enthusiasmus. Das ist auch ein positiven Aspekt, die Krise vielleicht hat, nämlich ein wieder sehr viel besser koordiniertes Auftreten, ein gemeinsames Auftreten, ein koordiniertes außenpolitisches, sicherheitspolitisches Auftreten vieler europäischer Akteure. Gleichzeitig gibt es ein long-standing Issue, das im humanitären Bereich Koordination seit vielen, vielen Jahren bemängelt wird, dass es nicht sehr gut funktioniert, dass es dort dringend einen Aufbruch bräuchte, dass die Krise in der Ukraine auch belegt, dass beispielsweise das Geberfunding bedingt koordiniert ist und die Ukraine-Krise sehr stark finanziert ist, dass die Hilfe bedingt koordiniert ist mit lokalen Akteurinnen und Akteuren, dass also eigentlich der Bedarf für eine Wende in der Koordination humanitärer Hilfe dort auch eher unterstrichen wurde, aber nicht unbedingt viel passiert. Frau Potzel, jetzt sind Sie ja als Director General für die Abteilung von Stabilisierung, Peacebuilding, humanitärer Hilfe an der Schnittstelle von Koordination und natürlich auch mit den europäischen Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Vielleicht fangen wir mit dem deutschen Setting einmal an. Wie schätzen Sie diese Debatte ein? Auf der einen Seite den Wunsch nach einem viel koordinierteren, viel strategischeren Auftreten. Wir haben auch vorhin geteilt, inwieweit wir dort noch teils Fortschritte, aber auch Defizite im humanitären Setting sehen in Deutschland und einem integrierteren, strategischeren Auftreten, aber eben auch dem Wunsch einer klaren Trennung zwischen humanitären Aufgaben und Prinzipien. Und was bedeutet das für die deutsche Struktur und wie fit for purpose man dort ist? Nee, ich glaube, sprechen Sie vielleicht einfach ganz. Es sollte eigentlich an sein, sonst bitte nochmal anmachen. Oder das Mikrofon hat ein Problem.
Das? Hören Sie mich? Ja.
Sehr gut.
Prima. Also erstmal ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein und mit Ihnen ins Gespräch zu kommen. Also, die Bedeutung eines koordinierten, abgestimmten Vorgehens teile ich sehr und ich kenne auch die Kritik. Und natürlich wäre es jetzt vermessen zu sagen, es läuft alles schon 100% fantastisch. Wir sind uns, glaube ich, alle einig, dass ein Mehr und ein Besser immer möglich ist und dass es auch wünschenswert wäre. Auf der anderen Seite, gerade wir im humanitären Bereich sind ja auch gefordert, rasch zu handeln in einer Krisensituation. Und das ist natürlich ein bestimmtes Spannungsfeld. Ja? Einerseits koordiniert vorgehen, andererseits sofort schnell eine Reaktion zeigen. Ich denke aber, dass gerade der Ukraine-Kontext uns jetzt zeigt, dass wir gut miteinander kooperieren und gut miteinander vernetzt arbeiten. Ich denke, man hat hier gesehen, wie die Bundesregierung gemeinsam in allerkürzester Zeit wirklich viel Hilfe auf den Weg gebracht hat. Und da hat tatsächlich jedes Ressort der Bundesregierung seinen Beitrag geleistet. Wir haben regelmäßige Lagebesprechungen im Auswärtigen Amt dazu, wo wir uns koordinieren und absprechen. Aber das geht auch jeden Tag auf der Arbeitsebene zwischen den Häusern sehr eng in die Abstimmung zu bestimmten Projekten und Umsetzungsfragen. Ich will mal ein Beispiel nennen, zum Beispiel auch mit nachgeordneten Behörden, wie zum Beispiel oder Institutionen wie dem THW, arbeiten wir eng zusammen. Jetzt im Moment geht es auch weiter um die Lieferung von Dieselgeneratoren, ganz wichtig mit Blick auf die Frage Energiesicherheit in der Ukraine, und Winterization ist ja da immer das Stichwort, also fit machen für den Winter. Wir arbeiten eng in der humanitären Hilfe mit NGOs, aber natürlich auch mit den großen internationalen Organisationen zusammen. Auch da wirklich fast ein täglicher Austausch. Ich selber war jetzt auch in den letzten Wochen viel unterwegs und habe an den verschiedensten Stellen, ob nun in Genf, in New York oder jetzt war ich gerade auch auf der COP, wo man natürlich nicht nur über Segmente gesprochen hat, sondern über die Vielzahl der Themen, die wir auf dem Tisch haben, wo wir uns eben da auch abstimmen. Wir haben als Auswärtiges Amt auch den sogenannten Stabilitätshub gegründet, der eben für die Koordination und Vernetzung unserer Anstrengungen Sorge tragen soll. Für die Ukraine, im Moment ist der in Warschau angesiedelt. Wir hoffen, dass wir den doch eines Tages und hoffentlich nicht in allzu großer Ferne dann eben auch nach Kiew verlegen können. Wir hatten schon Pläne, aber dann fingen halt die Bombardierungen wieder an, sodass wir gesagt haben, das ist jetzt doch zu unsicher. Aber dieser Stabilitätshub funktioniert und arbeitet. Auch das ein schönes Zeichen für Kooperation. Und wir haben natürlich unsere Partner aus dem BMZ, die auch an Fragen Infrastruktur, Wiederaufbau natürlich schon längst arbeiten. Aber Koordination hier zu Hause geht natürlich auch über AA-BMZ-Rahmen hinaus, mit dem BMVG sehr, sehr enge Zusammenarbeit auch mit dem BML. Wir arbeiten im sogenannten Kleeblattverfahren da zusammen. Zum Beispiel auch zur Unterstützung des Gesundheitssektors, aber auch wenn es um Fragen geht, Verlegung von Verletzten zum Beispiel. Da ist natürlich eine ganz enge Abstimmung nötig, auch wenn wir an das große Thema Ernährungskrise denken. Auch da enge Abstimmung zwischen den verschiedenen Ressorts, AA, BMZ, BML. Wir haben eine Taskforce gegründet, die sich regelmäßig zusammentrifft, um abzustimmen, was machen wir denn da. Wir haben auch gemeinsam eine internationale Konferenz ausgerichtet zum Stichwort Ernährungskrise. Wir haben eine enge Kooperation auch mit dem BMWK zum Thema Energiesicherheit. Also ich glaube, man kann sehen, dass das funktionieren kann und auch tatsächlich im Alltag funktioniert. Wir haben ja auch mit dem BMZ standardmäßig den GAAP-Prozess, den wir auch leben. Ich will aber auch sagen, dass es mir auch ein persönliches Anliegen ist, den berühmten Nexus, und ich weiß, viele können das Wort nicht mehr hören, aber den berühmten Nexus wirklich auch noch stärker zu leben und zu implementieren. Sowohl bei uns im Hause, wir haben ja diese beiden in der Abteilung bei mir 2 Stränge, HUHI und Stabilisierung, und diese beiden Stränge stärker zu vernetzen, ist mir auch ein persönliches Anliegen, und dann darüber hinaus den nächsten Schritt, auch die GAP mit dem BMZ noch intensiver und noch besser in konkreten Projekten, in konkreten Konfliktsituationen oder Krisensituationen eben auch zu leben, ist uns als Haus und ist mir eben auch wirklich sehr, sehr wichtig. Also es kann funktionieren.
Vielen Dank dafür. Wir hatten in dem Panel zuvor im Grunde, sagen wir mal, 2 Lager. Das eine machte sich große... Genau, vielleicht auch 8, aber geäußert haben sich mindestens 2 Lager. Zum einen der Blickwinkel, dass eine bessere Vernetzung nicht unbedingt der Aktion, der Programme, der Ansätze, aber ein besser strategisches, koordiniertes Vorgehen doch dringend geboten wäre und es dort noch Defizite gibt. Beispiel aus dem Sahel haben wir gehört, multiple Ministerien sind zuständig und es fehlt im Grunde eine kohärente Strategie, auch eine Exit-Strategie für Situationen wie jetzt. Und natürlich das andere Lager, das sagte, das Letzte, was wir brauchen, ist eine Integration humanitärer Hilfe in einen vernetzten Ansatz von Stabilisierung und Sicherheit und so weiter. Bevor wir jetzt quasi auf Punkt 1 kommen, Sie sagten ja, Sie kennen auch die Kritik daran. Vielleicht gehen wir kurz darauf ein. Sie leiten nun eine Abteilung, die schon institutionell zwei Dinge integriert, wo viele sagen, das hat aus prinzipiellen Gründen, buchstäblich humanitären prinzipiellen Gründen, nichts integriert miteinander zu tun und sollte auch nicht vereint werden, auch nicht institutionell. Wie gehen Sie mit dieser Kritik um?
Also ich glaube sehr daran, dass wir ohne ein vernetztes Arbeiten und ein vernetztes Denken unsere Ziele verfehlen. Wir brauchen die verschiedenen Akteure, auch nicht zu zeitlich auseinander dividiert, miteinander am Tisch. Das ist auch eine Diskussion, die in vielen Gesprächen mit Vertretern von internationalen Organisationen der humanitären Hilfe jetzt schon in den letzten Wochen, ich bin ja noch nicht so lange dabei, auch immer wieder hochgekommen ist. Und auch die betonen, wir brauchen die Entwicklungshilfe frühzeitig schon mit am Tisch. Wir brauchen auch die Stabilisierungsaspekte frühzeitig mit am Tisch. Wir wollen raus aus den humanitären Situationen, aus den humanitären Krisenlagen und wir brauchen dafür, großes Stichwort, Martin Griffiths spricht immer von Resilienzstärkung. Wir brauchen das und deshalb ist es, glaube ich, auch immer gut, Beispiele zu haben, wo es funktioniert hat, um zu zeigen, dass das der Weg raus sein kann aus der Krise, um nicht in diese Perpetuation, die wir ja leider in vielen Kontexten sehen, von einer über Jahrzehnte lang, also in Teilen auch Jahrzehnte währenden humanitären Krise zu stecken, sondern auch rauszukommen und neue Wege dann eben zu ermöglichen für die Menschen, die in diesen Krisensituationen leben.
Ich würde vorschlagen, wir parken mal die Diskussion über die notwendige Abgrenzung, Firewalls, welche Art von Integration ist notwendig und fokussieren uns, das kommt aus dem Publikum mit Sicherheit gegen Ende nachher nochmal, insofern muss ich da, glaube ich, nicht den Anwalt spielen. Vielleicht konzentrieren wir uns so ein bisschen auf Koordination humanitärer Politik selbst. Ich würde gerne ganz kurz ein Zitat teilen, um nochmal kurz beim deutschen Setting zu bleiben und auch den multiplen Akteuren, die da vielfach gesehen werden. In den Rahmen der Interviews und der Studie, die wir gemacht haben zu unserem Paper, sagte stellvertretend ein Vertreter eines westeuropäischen Staates, der selbst ein humanitärer Direktor ist. Also wir reden jetzt nicht von jemand, der zum ersten Mal mit Deutschland zu tun hat. Auch er ist verwirrt, was die Akteurinnen und Akteure anbelangt. Nun sind Sie selbst ja auch erst seit 3 Monaten in dem Feld. Wie geht es Ihnen denn so mit den multiplen Akteuren?
Ja, also ich sage mal, steile Lernkurve, ja? Wer sich da alles in dem Feld so tümmelt, in der Tat. Ich denke, in der Tat muss es uns auch ein Anliegen sein, bin ich sicher, ob die Staatssekretärin dazu heute Morgen auch was gesagt hat, den gemeinsamen Auftritt und die Visibilität, die Sichtbarkeit zu stärken. Per se ist ja überhaupt nichts dagegen zu sagen, dass viele sich an einem guten Ziel beteiligen und sich engagiert in die Arbeit einbringen. Was uns, und dafür spricht ja das Zitat auch, noch nicht so gelingt, ist so ein gemeinsamer Auftritt nach draußen deutlich zu machen, hier agiert Deutschland, hier agieren deutsche Organisationen gemeinsam. Und das ist uns jetzt auch ein ganz wichtiges Anliegen, das nach draußen kenntlicher zu machen und das Verständnis dann da vielleicht auch ein bisschen wachsen zu lassen, dass die Vielfalt eher eine Stärke ist als eine Schwäche, aber dass wir alle gemeinsam an einem Strang ziehen und gemeinsam nach außen eben dann auch in Erscheinung treten.
Gibt es intern noch Dinge, die jetzt auch schon besser werden könnten in der Kooperation mit den anderen Akteurinnen und Akteuren?
Hier in Deutschland? Also, wie ich eben schon gesagt habe, mehr ist immer gut und wir arbeiten eben daran, tatsächlich eben in dieser Nexus-Debatte da tatsächlich auch die Akteure besser zu vernetzen. Wir haben ja verschiedene auch Foren, wo wir zusammenkommen können, wo wir uns darüber austauschen und ich glaube, das ist wichtig, diese Foren auch zu stärken, damit wir ein gemeinsames Verständnis entwickeln. Es gibt ja auch in der humanitären Hilfe eine Menge auch konzeptionelle, strategische Überlegungen, wo wir auch viele, auch Sie, mit an Bord brauchen, um diese konzeptionellen Dinge weiterzuentwickeln. Und diese Foren müssen wir noch, glaube ich, stärken. Aber es ist jetzt auch schon so, dass wir, wie gesagt, in der täglichen Arbeit uns mit sehr, sehr vielen Akteuren sehr gut vernetzen und da eben auch gemeinsam überlegen, in welche Richtung wir in dem jeweiligen Kontext eben auch gehen wollen.
Vielleicht noch kurz zur Ebene internationaler Koordination, bevor wir vielleicht ein bisschen die Kolleginnen und Kollegen in die Diskussion bringen und dann wieder auch sofort wieder auf sie zurückkommen können, zu dem, was aufgebracht wird. Wir hatten schon gesprochen über, es gibt große Freude über eine bessere Zusammenarbeit. Sie hatten auch betont, dass im Zuge der Ukraine-Krise man sich sehr gut zusammengetan hat, sich sehr koordiniert hat. Gleichzeitig Stichwort Koordination der humanitären Politik unter Europäern werden vielfach von Beobachterinnen weiterhin Defizite beklagt. Ganz konkret auf Brüsseler Ebene zu betonen, das ist schön, dass man sich im COHAFA austauscht, aber es ist ein reiner Informationsaustausch. Es ist schön bei unseren Gesprächen in New York oder Genf, dass es diese Group of Friends gibt, WhatsApp-Gruppen und so weiter. Selten geht es über Information Sharing hinaus in Richtung Koordination oder gerade strategische Themensetzung gemeinsam, auch nicht von like-minded Geberregierungen, die gemeinsam etwas bewegen wollen. Nun haben wir eine Situation, wo durch die Zeitenwende, die wir vielfach schon diskutiert haben als sicherheitspolitische Zeitenwende, ist unter Humanitären, und ich glaube, da kann man sehr viele unterschiedliche Akteure zusammenbringen, ein Gefühl gibt von, ja, wir müssen unser Thema gemeinsam promoten, wir müssen es höher auf die Agenda bringen. Wie kann das aber gelingen, wenn ein koordinierter Ansatz nicht besser gelingt? Und wo sehen Sie da Defizite auch auf Regierungsseite, auch zwischen den Westeuropäern zum Beispiel?
Wir haben im letzten Jahr mit den Abstimmungsprozedere tatsächlich und den Austausch mit like-minded erheblich ausgebaut. Bilaterale Konsultationen, strategische Konsultationen mit vielen Gleichgesinnten getätigt, durchgeführt, auch zur konzeptionellen Fortentwicklung von humanitären Ansätzen. Wir haben jetzt gerade, muss ich gerade kurz überlegen, ich glaube, vor 2 Wochen hatten wir strategische Konsultationen zum Beispiel mit den nordischen Staaten. Und solche Dinge gilt es in der Tat auszubauen. Wir haben, wie Sie sagen, COHAFA und andere natürlich Formate, wo wir uns auch mit der EU austauschen. Ich bin auch im regelmäßigen Kontakt mit ECHO, mit Herrn Köhler und nicht nur ich, sondern meine Kolleginnen und Kollegen auch. Das darf aber, finde ich, auch ruhig noch konkreter werden. Und in konkrete Projekt- und Projektsituationen sozusagen sich auch noch deutlich herunterbrechen. Da bin ich ganz bei Ihnen. Wir haben aber auch, wenn wir über die internationale Ebene sprechen, die G7-Präsidentschaft genutzt, um das Thema stärker zu besprechen. Da gab es eben eine eigene Arbeitsgruppe Humanitäres, die wir als Plattform genutzt haben, eben um auch Themen zu setzen und zu bespielen. Vorausschauende humanitäre Hilfe ist zum Beispiel eins dieser Themen, aber auch Vorgehen und abgestimmtes Vorgehen in der Ernährungskrise. Ein anderes Thema, was mir sehr, sehr wichtig ist, ist Minenräumen. Auch da haben wir im G7-Rahmen sehr intensive Gespräche zugeführt. Wir haben ständige formelle, informelle, Sie haben es schon gesagt, WhatsApp geht auch immer mal, Abstimmungen in Genf und New York, aber will Ihnen gar nicht widersprechen, dass wir da als internationale Gemeinschaft in konkreten Situationen in den Ländern definitiv auch noch an uns arbeiten können.
Danke dafür bis hierhin. I would like to move now in the first place to Gareth in Geneva. I hope you can hear and see us.
I can indeed, thank you.
Many thanks for joining us. I hope we can hear you, but let's give it a try. Gareth, you are well positioned to talk about humanitarian coordination. For a start, your background has been as a country director in a couple of humanitarian crises which have been watershed moments for humanitarian reform and affairs, Haiti earthquake, tsunami, where discussion about the lack of coordination has been really high on the agenda, and a couple of attempts to reform the system have followed after these crises. Now you're for almost 10 years, I believe, in Geneva at the hub of humanitarian coordination, or the attempt to achieve it on the various levels between the various actors. As Executive Secretary of the Steering Committee of, let me check, to do this really right, SCHR, the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response. You represent 9 major agencies, including Caritas, CARE, the Red Crescent Movement, etc., and can speak on their behalf. If you look into the issue of humanitarian coordination, for example, in the interagency committee in Geneva and beyond, in the Grand Bargain you're engaged in, what's your take? Has there been a lesson learned, and what do we need to learn maybe from the current crisis and what follows Ukraine? Over to you.
Absolutely, thank you. And just if you could give me a hands up just to confirm you can hear me okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Great, brilliant. So having heard from Deike on governmental coordination, I would like to talk a little bit about the humanitarian coordination in, as the quote you shared said, all its complexity and how it's working at the moment. But I'd also like to expand it a little to how we can shift that policy framing to address the kind of radical change that this conference is looking for. So as the introduction noted, as the SCHR Secretary, I'm really engaged in a lot of those forums. I'm SCHR's representative at the Interagency Standing Committee. I sit on the Emergency Directors Group. I sit on the Operational Policy and Advocacy Group. I also sat for 2 years on the Grand Bargain Facilitation Group, and I also regularly join a subcommittee of the OECD DAC. So I'm perhaps uniquely positioned to talk to these issues. And currently my sense is that for good reasons, due to overstretch, due to overload and prioritization, interagency coordination between the humanitarian agencies, let alone coordination between the different constituencies like the local actors, the donors, the UN and the NGOs. It's in a bit of a reductionist phase. We're kind of reducing our ambition. My sense is that we're struggling to find the ideas and the energy and the enthusiasm that we saw after the World Humanitarian Summit. And on one level, this seems like a sensible strategy, right? When we're struggling to prevent perhaps hundreds of thousands of deaths in the Horn of Africa, in places like Myanmar and Afghanistan, investing in policy discussions and coordination can seem a poor, maybe even an inappropriate investment, particularly when frontline colleagues say they struggle to read the resulting policy anyway. So you can understand why people feel it's sometimes better to invest in the nuts and bolts of humanitarian response. And I think we're seeing this in most of the major policy forums that I engage in. We're seeing an emphasis on short-term concrete outcomes that have direct applicability, and we see time-limited structures like the current ISC task forces, which they're planned to expire in just 13 months, as if we're going to solve accountability or humanitarian access in such a short time scale. And it was interesting at the Grand Bargain, we had a clear call for leadership in last year's annual report that was published in June. Yet on a key call I was on Monday, none of the biggest UN agencies spoke about how they were implementing their Grand Bargain commitments. And we had a call with donors as part of the participation workstream recently, and there was real reluctance to invest heavily in these structures. And I think there's a real risk in these approaches, in this stepping back. And I think that actually these meetings have a huge value in themselves, because without those regular discussions about our day-to-day work and the established relationships that you build through those discussions, it's very hard to understand the dynamics even within the sector, and even harder to then connect those dynamics, those humanitarian coordination dynamics, with the dynamics outside the sector. For example, as we just heard, within governments and between nation states. So to have those difficult conversations, we need familiarity with the different mandates of different organizations. We need that understanding and we need the trust. Otherwise, we're likely to end up with the wrong solutions. You're likely to misunderstand each other's analysis or proposed solutions. And that means we miss those big opportunities for the kind of big shifts that this conference is seeking. I think that's in a context as well where humanitarian needs are escalating, and they're likely to escalate further as well. Countries such as Sri Lanka and Lebanon, which were safely off the humanitarian agenda, are now back on. And there are many big middle-income states who could follow, dramatically increasing our humanitarian caseload. At the start of this year, we were struggling with the level of humanitarian demand, and that was before the invasion of Ukraine. That's a whole additional caseload on top of what we were already dealing with. So the danger is that we're not investing sufficiently in these big game-changing ideas that might enable us to get ahead of these challenges. And Gareth, that's just within the sector. So I think to wrap up, one of the things I want to come back to is why it's really important that we develop policy solutions with those outside the sector if we're going to have any hope of that kind of big picture sea change. And I'm not talking here about the private sector, I'm talking about government, what we just heard about, the media and private citizens. And I think part of the problem is that we're too focused on our own work. The grand bargain focuses almost entirely on how humanitarians work. It's the same with the ISC. We don't talk enough about how we humanitarians mobilize the political, the economic, the diplomatic and the security agendas of our societies. And we know that if you put a humanitarian agenda up against a political one, it loses. It's the same with economic, it's the same with diplomatic, it's the same with security agendas. Humanitarian always comes out as a nice to have rather than an essential. And I think one of the things we've seen is that the world can really ignore large-scale humanitarian disasters. We've seen it in Ethiopia, we've seen it largely in Somalia, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Afghanistan. When was the last time we last saw Syria on the news? So for the kind of sea change this conference is seeking, we really need to get beyond our internal discussions and engage more with wider society. And in particular, we need to trump the economic agenda. This idea that after COVID in Ukraine, there's simply not the resources to address the scale of humanitarian needs.
Gareth, let me quickly jump in because you mentioned Sorry for interrupting. Just to come back to the point you made in the beginning for this first round, humanitarian coordination so far is pretty short-term driven and not really following long-term objectives and not really strategic as you see it on the Geneva level, if I got you right. If you would need to analyze why is this the case? I mean, is it just a lack of effort? Is it just an oversight, or aren't there interest coming into play if you talk about governments in the first place, national interest versus long-term common goods? Isn't that an issue which you need to deal with on the Geneva level, for example?
Well, so I think it's two things. It's one is that there's this challenge of overload. The other is this challenge of how do we get beyond the humanitarian to those bigger picture discussions about the political, about the security, about the economic. And that's where we have to be joined up on what we're saying as humanitarian, but also pushing it outside of our comfort zone, outside of our humanitarian sphere, into the kind of different government ministries that we just heard about. How do you make a security ministry, a defense ministry care about humanitarian and get it beyond? I mentioned that humanitarian often seems to be a nice to have rather than essential. And how do we push that into the essential category? So, for example, a few of our big conversations, localization. If we're talking about localization as a way to improve the efficiency of humanitarian, it's always going to be quite marginal to our colleagues in defense ministries, in finance ministries, in chancelleries. If we can talk about that as a way to build stable, enriching societies that we can engage with on a trade level, on a tourism level. And tourism is an interesting one. In humanitarian terms, there's a huge premium on, if you look at the tsunami response, if you look at the Nepal earthquake, we get lots more engagement, lots more support for disasters that happen in places where people have visited, where citizens of Europe have visited being on holiday. That's the kind of connection that makes people really care. And we're not making those connections, which is why it's left as a nice to have.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Gareth. Ms. Potzel, maybe quickly taking one point Gareth has raised. How do we get beyond the humanitarian bubble? How do we create a narrative which highlights that? Even in the German debate, some people say, well, if we touched on the national security strategy developed right now in the Foreign Office, many see it as focusing on the humanitarian and human security dimension, very limited. Or even if we talk about COP and climate change, that the humanitarian dimension in it is internationally pretty much ignored. Is that your take as well? You mentioned you have been at COP. Is that an issue where we need to look much better into to get humanitarian issues beyond our bubble for better coordination of the policies?
Well, I think it's always good to talk about the issue, no doubt about it. But then on the other hand, I don't have the impression that this is only a nice to have. I mean, if you look at the debates that we just had on the German budget, for instance, Parliament was extremely supportive, and parliamentarians feel that this is an important issue to put money where our mouth is. And so next year, again, we will have a very, very good budget for humanitarian assistance. Of course, there can always be more, but this year, I'm sure Susanne Baumann, the State Secretary, said that this morning, this year, we got 3.2 billion, making us the second biggest donor in the world. And next year, we are starting off with 2.7 billion. So there is huge support, and this support goes sort of, or is rooted in a deep understanding that it is important to tackle these issues and to invest into humanitarian assistance. And also when I travel abroad, I don't have that feeling that people just see it as, you know, like a side issue or something, but that a lot of effort is put in. When it was just said that there is a lack of enthusiasm, I mean, for the people I work with, I can say there's a lot of enthusiasm for the issues, a lot of energy that is put into their daily work. And I feel that it is like also the same in the people I talk with internationally. But yes, for the general public, it is always helpful to tell a good story, in the sense, good story in terms of, I mean, we're mainly talking very sad stories, but to tell what people are doing and to bring people into that conversation, that is most certainly very helpful. Although I figure in today's world, it is also very difficult to get through with your points because there's so much information out there. But yeah, it's worth trying, definitely.
We keep coming back to the budget, but maybe we do it for one more minute. We had a discussion as well, a bit putting into context that it's good news that the Parliament redrafted the budget last minute and re-established what's been put on the table initially for this year. At the same time, in the German context, if we talk about Zeitenwende, etc., we have the 100 billion for the German army modernization, we have the 200 billion for easing the inflation burden, etc., for all of us, because we have to pay higher heating costs. So it sounds a bit like, well, it's a nitty-gritty to discuss that last minute we re-establish a budget versus really let it mirror a humanitarian awakening that we are really in new times, that climate change will raise needs, that Ukraine crisis has globally raised needs. Is that enough? Of course, Germany is the leading one on international terms, but overall, if you put it into a Zeitenwende context in Germany, is it enough?
First of all, I wouldn't say that we kind of last minute got a decent budget, but I mean, we started off in the debates with like 2 billion, which was already much more than in 2020 or 2021 even. So I think it's a convincing budget, I feel. Also, as we said, you know, if you compare it internationally. But we also know that the needs are much bigger. And what I feel is really important, and that's something that we will be trying to push, or we will be pushing rather, not only trying, but we will be pushing, is to broaden the donor base internationally, because we can't handle it all ourselves, or with like the 3 donors that are giving 60% of the international humanitarian budget. But we need to bring others into that conversation, and not only in terms of financing, but indeed also into the conceptual debate. It's difficult, it's been tried before, but we need private sector, we need other countries, of course, philanthropy. So we need a lot more sort of actors from civil society also to get engaged and to help us meet the needs of people in dire crisis situations.
Many thanks. A German parliamentarian lately reiterated the 1-to-1 proportion that defense spending and humanitarian spending should rise on the same levels under the new government, and everybody got the dollar sign in their eyes. So let's see how that will play out in the midterm. Ed, let's move to a topic which goes a bit beyond governments we like to talk so much about and complain about, and also look a bit into other humanitarian actors. At Schenkenberg, you are the director of HERE, a think tank in Geneva with a strong focus on humanitarian coordination. 2 weeks ago, we co-hosted an event on humanitarian leadership with a couple of think tanks and a couple of humanitarian actors in Berlin. And there has been one interesting common thread, a bit going along the line as a leadership issue, that we have a conflict between individual agency and organizational interest and humanitarian common goods. And this is a major obstacle for advocacy, for humanitarian reform, for humanitarian change. You shared a paper on that one. Why is that such a key issue?
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ralf. Thanks really for that. Yeah, very interesting debate about 2 weeks ago, precisely on the topic you mentioned. Let me just say, actually, so quite rightly you mentioned that recently my organization has done a lot of work on humanitarian coordination. A statement we continuously hear is that, well, everybody, it's sort of a popular saying, right? Everybody wants to be wants coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. Actually, I think that statement misses the point, which is precisely around leadership. Participating in humanitarian coordination is on a voluntary basis. Often, indeed, agencies do participate there because of the money. There's money involved, certainly in relation to the pooled funds and so on. But the point is precisely that what we have seen is that agencies do come to the table to particularly promote, and it's understandable in a way. They come to the table to promote their issue. So WFP calls it the food crisis. UNHCR calls it the displacement crisis. UNICEF probably a wash or education crisis. WHO a health crisis. And I could go on. And in a way, they're all, you could say it's all of the above, right? But that then indeed, and we're approaching Christmas, so I think this is a good metaphor. It sort of then becomes a Christmas tree, humanitarian coordination. This is exactly something we have seen with the Grand Bargain, by the way. Everybody starts to push their priority onto the tree, and at the end, you wonder really, what are we seeing now? And that, I think, is interesting to hear in that sense. Gareth saying, actually, the way I understood him is sort of, maybe there's kind of more now an idea, we should focus more, we should perhaps reduce a little bit our ambitions. I think that's a very interesting thought, because clearly, in my view, we did get ahead of ourselves. And I think Gareth referred to that when he particularly mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit and all the commitments that came with it. The good news, you could say, certainly if I also listen to Deike Potzel, on the humanitarian side, we have the mechanisms, and Gareth has already mentioned quite a number of them. There's no lack of those. But we are relatively well organized compared to other sectors as such. But as I said, we have three, I think, particular issues. One is exactly this mandate-drivenness, rather than ensuring that coordination is context-based, it's contextualized, linked to the context. Put something in place that is relevant, rather than coming with prefab structures, 12 clusters all at the same time, because those are our mandates. That's one. Second, I already mentioned leadership. This is not command and control, but leadership particularly is what we all bring to the table, based on what we see, but then also recognizing, in fact, we're working here for the collective, as such. And that is particularly goes very much to your question, where the problem comes in, because too often agencies come with their particular perspective. It's kind of understandable in the way the system is organized, and particularly where the incentives come from. Much of it is money related, but it is a problem, as such, that there is insufficient recognition of why we are here collectively, so to speak.
Okay.
And thirdly, if I may, the last point, I think also Gareth pointed a little bit to it, the question around, particularly the theme of these 2 days, the question of a Zeitenwende, particularly thinking of the role and importance of local actors who obviously should drive coordination, should be the leaders and so on. I mean, I haven't heard it yet, and it's quite interesting. I don't know who of you is aware of the state of the report, the State of the Humanitarian System. It's buried on page 58, quite deep in the report. You don't find it in the executive summary. 47% of all funding goes to 3 organizations: UNICEF, UNHCR, and WFP. Okay. I mean, that says enough where we are in terms of localization, not very far.
Many thanks, Ed. Gareth, if you wish a quick reaction to what Ed said, probably he named a couple of UN agencies. We could probably name a couple of INGOs and the big 5. Could you quickly comment on to which extent do you see an issue in individual agency overriding common objectives also in the civil society arena?
It is a challenge. I would say that for example, the cluster system is much more designed about modules you can deploy. I think the challenge is that what we need is those kind of cross-sectoral responses that are integrated, and that doesn't fit so well with the kind of mandates that the UN's been given and the individual UN agencies have been given. I absolutely agree with Ed's point on leadership. And I shared this with you earlier, Ralf. A key challenge is that everyone says they want to be leaders, but when you present them with a challenging idea, they generally ask who's already doing it, which is not leadership, right? So I think that's also key. But I think also, unless we can make that connection between what we're doing to wider society, we'll really struggle. And one way we've done that, for example, is with cash. So cash is great because it's flexible, but also the effort to connect cash programs to wider social safety nets. That then plugs our humanitarian conversation into a wider societal conversation. And I think that's where things get interesting and where we can get ahead of this huge humanitarian need. And that's the kind of area where I think we might get the shift. And thanks, Ralf, for highlighting the financial disparities, because I do think we need to be plugged into those bigger dimensions of politics and of economics and beyond just our dealing with those in most acute needs, if we're going to make it relevant to the wider societies that fund this effort.
Many thanks, Gareth. Wir haben den Übersetzern eine Chance gegeben, ein bisschen zu pausieren und durchzuatmen. Ich hoffe, das hat geholfen. Ich würde zu Sonja Hövelmann wechseln, die Sie ja schon heute vielfach erlebt haben, Research Fellow am CHA. Und zuletzt mit dem schon erwähnten Grand Bargain intensiv beschäftigt. Das Beispiel Koordination und wie ein koordinierter Ansatz Reformen bewegen kann oder eben begrenzt dies funktioniert, dafür kann der Grand Bargain auch als Beispiel vielleicht dienen. Die führenden Akteurinnen und Akteure in diesem Reformprozess, für alle, die nicht alle Details vertraut sind, dort gemeinsam versuchen, in mehreren thematischen Schwerpunkten, in sogenannten Caucuses, die entscheidenden Reformthemen voranzubringen, vor allem Lokalisierung, haben wir schon drüber gesprochen, und besseres Funding. Deutschland spielt eine große Rolle da drin, aber auch andere große europäische Akteure. Was waren denn die Lehren, die aus deiner Analyse kamen zum Grand Bargain, wie die Policies dort vorangebracht werden könnten und was könnte sich bessern, zum Beispiel auf deutscher Seite?
Yeah, if it's all right, I would also...
Oh, you stick to English, okay.
English, because I prepared all my notes in English, and it'll be more difficult to switch. Yeah, I think it really depends on what kind of viewpoint you take in this discussion, whether you think we should think more long-term or whether we should reduce the ambition. And I think this is also relevant for the Grand Bargain because there's very different expectations to what this process can actually achieve. So on the one side, we have this this view of a system-wide transformation that's putting local actors and affected populations in the driver's seat, and we certainly do not see this happening with the Grand Bargain, at least not to date. If you have the expectation of a bettering of the status quo, I think, yes, the Grand Bargain is delivering more on that. We see more quality funding. We see an improvement on cash coordination. We also see that local actors are at the table and have a say. So I think it really depends on your ambition or expectation on this. You asked sort of a question regarding the role of civil society as well. And I think here, again, the Grand Bargain, whether you see it as a blessing or a curse, is also from the way it's structured. It's a reform from the sector for the sector. So, of course, individual agency and individual interests play a role within this agreed framework of enabling priorities and so on. But, of course, there's leverage for individual interests to be moved. I think compared to the first iteration of the Grand Bargain, we see that maybe within the Grand Bargain 2.0, this was actually more the case because just of the structure, the way the Grand Bargain 2.0 was structured, I think the time was much more dense. We only had 2 years or have 2 years. We also had this structure of the caucuses, which had very few actors present. So I think just judging from the outcome documents, there was maybe more room or scope for individual agency versus collective approach. I think this becomes obvious when you see at whose caucus finished first. So cash and quality funding were the first to close, localization came third. There was no caucus on the participation of affected populations. The percentage of funding going to local actors dropped during the first year of the Grand Bargain 2.0. So, I think that sort of shows that vital interests took a front seat, which were maybe more perpetuated by northern or the established actors. But yeah, again, as I said, it depends on the type of ambition that you have for the reform process, because in the end, it's also a forum where a variety of actors speak eye to eye, and we don't have the same set of actors in the IASC. We also don't have this within the Good Humanitarian Donorship Group. So to me, it remains a vital process.
Maybe following up quickly on the issue of coordination by Germany. Germany has a very prominent role in the Grand Bargain and much appreciated that they have taken part in the facilitation group since more or less the beginning. How would you judge on how the play has been done by the German government? Which role did it play? What has been an obstacle in terms of engagement and moving issues within the Grand Bargain with other actors?
Sure. Yeah, I think if we look at the Grand Bargain, we clearly see a development of Germany as a humanitarian actor, so which may be exemplary also for a broader development. I think Ralf and I, we presented on some of the survey findings, which show some development. But one interviewee told me that from her point of view, probably Germany would not have been asked to join the facilitation group back in 2016 when the Grand Bargain was set up. In 2021, they did join, maybe hesitantly. It at least took them 6 months to decide on this. But yeah, now they're there. Yeah, what I hear, they do so with commitment as well in the forums. They facilitated a retreat in May among the members of the facilitation group to set up a program. And they managed a lot of communications with the constituents. But yeah, maybe apart from that, they did not initiate or join a caucus. And judging from the interviews that I had, stakeholders engaged in the Grand Bargain thought that Germany is taking more of a moderating role in this, bringing forward processes to keep the Grand Bargain moving. And I mean, this is very vital, very important. But to other stakeholders, it wasn't so clear which priorities Germany sets within this agreed framework. And yeah, from my research, I think the quality funding caucus would have been an obvious choice, given that 2/3 of the German budget are spent multi-annually. But instead, they joined the intermediary caucus belatedly, even though their funding practice does not really suggest a very ambitious localization agenda, given that most of their share is going through intermediaries. And I think we heard Hibak Kalfan this morning also on US aid and their negotiations on direct funding to local actors. Yeah, I think given the limited resources maybe that Germany has staff-wise, I think there's still significant leverage that they could use. And I think this morning in the first panel, a few were mentioned already. I think Germany could be a bit more punchy on ensuring that funding partners, including UN, downstream administrative costs to their local partners, and make this also a standard agreement in, let's say, UN funding appeals, and also make sure that quality funding is downstreamed along the line. We heard this also from Mr. Köhler today, that it's not stuck in the first intermediary and then not passed along the chain. And yeah, to me, or my analysis, I think that given the significant funding that Germany contributes to the humanitarian system, these two angles would have significant leverage to improve the humanitarian system.
Many thanks, Sonja. Ms. Potzel, maybe we stick to the English now, if that's okay. In a nutshell, what we shared this afternoon about our research on the German progress on the policy side, but what was also part of the Grand Bargain analysis, is much appreciation indeed for Germany being very good in processes now, very well facilitating, having a lot of credibility to do so, but still missing more often than would have been appreciated the point to lead then on the policy side, to say, well, what do you want to achieve in these processes? Which reforms do you want to move? And for example, to engage more than in the core fora for that one, or beyond in other policy forums. A German colleague also told me it's really impressive that at this hub we are now everywhere, but I'm not totally sure what I want to shall achieve in all these fora now, and some more guidance would be helpful. Is that something you could?
Who was that?
Please, you will fix all that now, I know, but no, it's a key issue, is it?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I would like to sort of convey to you and the audience what I hear when I talk to people abroad and in international fora. There is a lot of appreciation for the German role, and they perceive us as indeed leading on many issues. Now, maybe they just want to be friendly, could be. So it's good that we talk also to other actors also in forums like these. But really people are, on the one hand, appreciating, on the other hand, indeed also saying we need you there. So go on, continue to do that. A lot of appreciation for our role in the Grand Bargain. Expectations high on us pushing on issues like localization, of course, on flexible funding. Now, we feel that we first of all also want to convince by our own model. So we've spent more than 40% this year on flexible funding. We have invested nearly 3. Next year we want to spend at least 5% of our budget for anticipatory action. So leading by example kind of thing is something that we are also trying to do. We definitely want to keep the grand bargain alive, and we hope that this forum will continue to be a platform that brings together, as you said, quite exceptionally players and actors from all fields, and to use it really as a forum for strategic and conceptual debate. We hope that we will manage to do that, but there is also here and there doubt also in the international organization, so we keep talking about this to them. A lot of positive feedback there. So again, as we said before, yes, more can be done, but we are trying. We are honestly trying with a lot of effort, and I think our sort of result sheet is not too bad, and I'm very glad that you also said that it's that it remains a vital tool, the grand bargain, and so I will promise that I can promise that we will keep pushing for it to remain alive and kind of up to speed and up to date with the debates that are necessary.
Many thanks. In a few minutes, we will bring in the audience from the chat and from the floor. Before coming back to Ed in 2 minutes, and Gareth, if you could mirror a bit your Geneva experience, we heard pretty much there is really a push for, could there be even more leadership and more coordination by the Germans? Which is not always a given that people in Europe say that. What's your take? Is this something which could be useful, and should Germany change maybe its approach more from processes to policies, or is that a misperception?
No, I'd say absolutely. I think a couple of key points. One is that the Grand Bargain 2.0 was deliberately designed to address the politics, both the kind of politics between different agencies and different agendas that Ed highlighted, but also the politics between how we kind of connect the Grand Bargain to the wider humanitarian and the wider kind of endeavour of society. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting, and I think was a super smart move by someone, was putting the Grand Bargain into the coalition agreement, because that also kind of connected it to that wider political sphere in Germany. And I think that's been really exciting to see. And that's the kind of action that we can see being very useful in other countries as well, in terms of, you know, how do we engage those different actors? And part of it is around kind of connecting it with those other agendas. I think that's really, really important if we're to get the kind of scale that the problem demands and make it relevant to taxpayers, to media, to others, to make those connections. But yes, so the leadership's definitely needed, and also the challenging leadership. So being unafraid to say that actually this big agency isn't delivering, or this big INGO isn't delivering, and we expect more. I know that often, you know, traditionally Germany's been uncomfortable doing that, but there's partnerships to help do that as well. So I think we can see those kind of political pushes that will drive the changes that we're looking for, both across the system and in the way the system connects with wider society.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Gareth. Maybe for sharing a final perspective, which we haven't touched on yet before we integrate anything from the floor. We keep talking a lot about coordination in Geneva, in the capitals, in Europe, a pretty northern debate so far. A lot of coordination is taking place, or should take place, actually where the affected populations live, where the agencies live, who do the local job, etc. For example, in Ukraine, where we hear a lot about a lack of coordination, a lack of integration of local actors, etc. And it tells us a story about the many crises before and which are still ongoing. If we take the coordination in this sense of the practitioners itself, the cluster approach has been established after the tsunami. It's a lot of criticism about it. You have looked into this as well and came up with a couple of ideas how this could be changed and what might need further analysis in which way. What are you thinking of? Which direction are you having in mind?
I'm going to answer that question.
And now you complain about the grand bargain before.
Well, there's one point I'd like to put on. Particularly, I don't underestimate or don't undervalue the contribution of Germany and, for that matter, of all those who participated in the grand bargain. But I suppose from all the people here, I'm a little less positive on it. Precisely because of this issue, it didn't address the incentives. If you're working in UNHCR, if you're working in WFP or UNICEF, you get rewarded for what you do for the organization. UNHCR's is there anyone from UNHCR? I mean, its internal planning does not even align with the collective refugee response plan. The metrics are different, so it doesn't even match as such. So this is how individual agency performance and collective working collectively, they don't add up, they don't match at the moment, and I haven't heard that discussion sufficiently in the grand bargain as such. And it really pushes me to say, the incentive structure, I think, is really something that requires a much more honest and frank dialogue between the donors and the agencies. Now, as to your question, because actually that is linked. There is, Gareth referred to the Interagency Standing Committee. At the country level, the mirror of that is the Humanitarian Country Team. And yes, there are local NGOs now at the Humanitarian Country Team. Well, they're also at the Geneva level in the Interagency Standing Committee. They're also in the clusters and so on. What is interesting, though, and again, it goes back to the incentives and the accountability, which are closely linked, of course. Let's take WFP, always a favorite topic of mine. The WFP country director in Nigeria reports to the regional bureau in Dakar. That one is not plugged into that Interagency Standing Committee Humanitarian Country Team structure. It looks at, indeed, what did the country director exactly do for WFP? And I could tell much more, but I won't go there now. But what it also means, what I also want to say there is really that, clearly, not all of, if I take Nigeria, particularly where I've looked at WFP, not all of Nigeria, I mean, the northeast and certainly also northwest, north central, those are really the crisis areas. But there are other parts that obviously are much more stable. So how can you ensure that you contextualize the coordination structures much more to those specific crises? Same for DR Congo, same for other crises. So the question I think the system needs to look at is, does it have the flexibility to set up the structures that are much more contextualized to that specific crisis? Ukraine would be a very good example. And then particularly also in how, the problem at the moment is, and we know this from talking to local NGOs, they feel foreigners in their own country. Even if they speak English, within these forums, there's a jargon that's spoken, technical terminology and so on. That is foreign to them. So what we have seen is, in fact, the clusters that we have looked at and that work much better, actually, so a clear example was an education cluster, which was run because, in fact, it's the education cluster, like many, but particularly education cluster, is supposed to be co-led, co-leadership between UNICEF and an NGO. UNICEF wasn't there because they hadn't filled the position, so it was, in fact, filled by an NGO, which turned out to be a local NGO. And suddenly, there were much more local NGOs participating in that body. Well, clearly, that points to a certain lesson. And so the way forward, I think, is much more indeed, how can we ensure that those structures are fit, actually, to what exists locally? What it does then, of course, raise, and I'm not underestimating the complexity here, is the question of accountability. The cluster system, since 2005, particularly brought a certain degree, at least in theory, of accountability, in the sense that these agencies, UN agencies that are supposed to lead these clusters, can also be held to account. Whether they are is another question, but at least that exists on paper, so to speak. Happens in certain situations, doesn't happen in others. The question is, accountability of local actors, absolutely, but they feel accountability particularly to national governments, And what if these national governments are part of the problem? What does that mean? And that and I think this was what Herr Köhler pointed to earlier today, specifically on the localization agenda and conversation. I think we really need to be very context specific and therefore nuanced also. Where is it, where can it work and where is it perhaps less feasible?
So it is looking into the concept of area-based coordination, where you have some hopes that this could fly. You keep naming UN agencies while you have been the executive director of ICWA, the NGO network in Geneva, which might not everybody know. Is it an UN issue only, or do we talk about NGOs as well?
Well, I'm a strong believer, certainly also because of my earlier work, exactly in the notion, for instance, of co-leadership, exactly between a UN agency, which has a formal mandate, compared to an NGO, which of course is self-imposed in that sense, or self-given. What we have seen actually is that this notion or concept of co-leadership is very poorly understood. First of all, because coordination has become very mechanical. That was very much also a theme we discussed about 2 weeks ago. It's driven by process, the humanitarian program cycle and everything that comes with it. It leads OCHA now to say, let's make coordination lighter. Sorry, they were there in the first place actually creating the humanitarian program cycle, so that is an interesting one. But what it also then, in that sense, means is exactly that we need to focus much more on sharing leadership, which is something else than just dividing the labor in terms of coordination tasks, following a certain templates and so on. I mean, what does sharing leadership mean, and how do you do that? And what we have seen actually is that in certain situations has worked where there's a more honest sort of equal. I mean, and that is what I liked, especially also earlier this afternoon, where the principle of solidarity was very much put in that context. It's not just, obviously, there is solidarity, particularly with the people affected by the crisis, but solidarity was also particularly mentioned in the sense of, the relationship between the large agencies and, of course, NGOs, and specifically local NGOs. Making sure that indeed they don't feel they're no longer foreigners in their own country, that they do feel empowered and can play a leadership role and all of that. And again, I think it's a sign of leadership to actually empower other leaders, so to speak. So that's exactly, I think, what UN agencies should be doing. Too often, as we know, it's still a very contractual relationship.
All right. Many thanks. If there is any question from the floor, please raise your hand. Then we would start with the floor. Kayu and everybody along with this row. So maybe Kayu can start.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I think it's okay.
Yeah, all right, good. Kayu Orellana, I work as a representative for the organization HELP from Germany, who is the German organization from Bonn. Regarding the German leadership role, so I think, or actually regarding coordination, I think the coordination of operational questions that implementers are facing day to day is a very different thing from the coordination mechanisms that the German government is involved in, whatever policy or advocacy discussions. So I think the mix-up is a little bit problematic because it's actually two different fields of work. But what I'm actually requesting from the German government, and this is where we come back to the very initial point that Mrs. Potzel made at the very start, was when it comes to the government policy coherence of the different branches that the government is actually representing and using for different mechanisms. So, for example, I think we all, if we are talking about anticipatory action and we don't want to stay in the silos, we need to go more into the direction to prevent or decrease the impact of humanitarian situations or new upcoming political crises and all these different questions. And I think this is where we need the German government more in a role. It's not necessary, because the thing is, when it comes to operational challenges, we got you, okay? We, the implementers, we actually have the solutions, and you know yourself that you, in your capacity and your manpower and your knowledge, you do not have the humanitarian tools because you're not an implementer. Where we need you is, for example, cases like using the hard power that you can technically have, for example, in cases like Turkey, where we have 3 different examples of massive international law breach with military interventions in Syria and in different places that is actually causing humanitarian suffering. despite the fact that these regions were relatively stable for some time. The other thing is the protection of humanitarian space, for example, sea rescue, yeah? Where you will have to go out of your way to only go the multilateral way until you ask everybody. France, Italy, everybody has to agree before Germany is actually going away. This could be in whatever way controversial, despite the fact that this is generating humanitarian suffering, human suffering. So I think the point is that Germany's leadership role is requested in a way where Germany will have to go, to some extent, in own controversial way, against the interests sometimes of other allies or neighbors or whatever, for the sake of protecting people. That's the point. Yeah.
Many thanks, Corinna.
Yeah, my name is Corinna Kreidler. I'm an independent consultant, and I would like to talk about cash. Because I think cash is the topic that links coordination, that links grand bargain, that links incentive structure, and the absence of leadership. Yes, the Grand Bargain 2.0 has found a new coordination model. Actors in Ukraine are already confirming that it hasn't changed any of the political discussions. It hasn't addressed the incentives question. It hasn't improved. We see 4 or 5 different parallel cash delivery mechanisms. And there's no one to be seen who could has the courage and the political leverage to address it. And unfortunately, I'm also one of those who is slightly less positive about the German situation, I'm afraid. And taking the example of cash, the Foreign Office has had 4 cash focal points in 2.5 years. That's not a way you can be a thought leader on such an important topic that has all the power to disrupt the system. But it's in no one's hand. That's also one of the effects, I think, of the Brits disappearing, so the UK disappearing, which has been for many, many years the thought leader on cash. And I see a void there, a policy void, a void of using that tool, even though we keep saying cash is the disruptor and cash can be the driver for change. But we are addressing it in processes, but we are not addressing it effectively and actually lead to, because if we were using most of the money based on multi-purpose, in the form of multi-purpose cash assistance based on multi-sectoral needs assessment, lots of the other questions that we have been discussing for the last hour would become obsolete. Thank you.
Many thanks. And the third one.
Patrick Khamadi from Humedica. I'm a policy advisor there. Mine will be a bit short. I think listening to this session and listening to the previous session, I would summarize it that we, the humanitarians, are in what one would call a post-midlife crisis. Why do I say that? I think there has been a bit of achievement. There have been quite a number of achievements if you look at the humanitarian number over the last 20 years. There are a number of things that it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the disaster risk reduction, so many things, that covenants that have been signed on. There's a bit of achievements. Building on those milestones, we are not doing very well. And I think here, that's where I see, and I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic about the role Germany is playing. The smiles you're getting because of the 3 billion that has been there and all that. Germany has to be very careful. What smiles am I getting? Are they smiles because we are a big player, or are they smiles because now there's money going in the pockets, as some people would put it? So I think the kind of dialogue that Germany should be engaged in, the kind of conversations Germany and the other players should be engaged in, needs to take cognizance of that. What do I also mean here? Because both at thematic levels, but also, when I relate, there are also other global players that are not necessarily in the room. There is China, that is not necessarily here, but they are the big, in terms of business with the South, that's a big area. So that is very important. Turkey has been mentioned, yeah. So in short, I think there's also a coordinative role that think tanks have to play in this. Great reminders, CHA and others, there's a role in which you have a big role, a firewall role, to keep up this continuity. That's one thing I would say. And on localization, I come from Kenya. And one of the things about localization is good. All of us are talking about localization. Localization is not just localization on the funds that are coming from the West. It's also localization in terms of the revenues that are generated locally. That's a very important component that needs to be put into this whole equation. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. I noted our homework. I'm happy that I don't need to touch on the midlife crisis. Deike Potzel, taking the example of cash, I'm not sure if you are happy to comment on that one, but cash has been raised many times as an example that coordination could be so much easier. It should be moved as a change of humanitarian programs. Is there a gap, for example, Germany should address much better?
Thank you very much. And let me first of all say, I always thought that like post-midlife crisis is actually quite a nice state. So like the crisis itself is probably more difficult. But anyways.
So where's Germany on that one?
Well, maybe we are still like, you know, good, strong adults.
We heard teenager this morning.
Oh, really? Okay. That's too troublesome then. Anyways, on a more serious note, thank you very much for the questions and so also for the critical feedback. I very much appreciate it, and I'm very grateful to be here to talk about these issues. And it's good that we have this space that we can talk about it. On cash, I think it is indeed one topic that we need to put more prominently on the agenda. We feel that it is an important tool, but yes, it would most certainly be something that we would like to talk more with our international partners and also with implementing bodies, with implementing organizations. So there's definitely something that we could do more. On the other hand, it was said then also in that question that Germany is not leading. Now, you mentioned, I think, staff or resource problems that we have. So we really need to focus on certain things, and we have been focusing, I think, on very important issues, as we mentioned, for instance, anticipatory action, which is very, very dear to our hearts. We were focusing on flexible funding. And other issues, localization was mentioned, but there are a few other that we are also putting on the spot. But you know, we are also developing our policies, and when we tick one box, that means that we are also looking at what other boxes there that we want to tick next. So it's definitely something that we want to look into. You want me to?
Yeah, maybe on the one which has been straightforward to you, on the coherent stuff and on the engagement, much more on diplomacy, much more IHL, less so much micromanagement of programming, I understand, operational issues.
I think this is sort of at least two pillars or multiple pillars that we are looking at into this question when we are talking about this question. First of all, what we do in our directorate is really dealing with the humanitarian and stabilization issues, the money, but also the conceptual framework that we were talking about. Now, the other issues, they are obviously handled by our ministry, by others in the government, and of course we are talking to these governments, we are talking to partners, we are talking also very critically on certain issues with countries all over the world when there is an issue. And sometimes you can read it in the paper, very often you won't. Because it's being talked about behind closed doors. And I can assure you that we make our points very clearly. We are also, like, when we talk humanitarian, I mean, the issue of humanitarian access is very often on the agenda also of our diplomatic talks when we talk to other governments. And that is part and parcel of what we do, of course. Our embassies are out there, they are constantly talking to their counterparts, to the government in the host country about these issues. I mean, that is sort of the core and part and parcel of foreign policy. This is exactly what we are talking about. And the countries that you mentioned, of course, we are talking with Turkey about what is going on now. Of course we do.
Many thanks.
He's not happy with the answer.
You're not? But Kayu, nobody can hear you online, so maybe you have a chance later on. Gareth, the point on where should donors actually engage in coordination terms and in coherence? Is it about operational issues, programming issues, and to which extent should it be much more about diplomacy and political issues to put in their weight in this arena? How would you comment on that?
Absolutely. So I completely agree with the point from Help. We do need that diplomatic weight, particularly on the tricky subjects like protection, like access. I guess the challenge that comes back to us, though, is how do we, to expect Germany to upset its allies, things like that, we'd need to kind of come back with a pretty compelling argument that links it to those Foreign Office policies, to an ambassador's policies in a particular challenge. And that's where I think we need to have those shared conversations. We need to be more creative about that, because just expecting them to do it because we say they should is unrealistic. It's how do we build that kind of shared narrative and as Ed said, incentives are important here. We need to work with those foreign policy specialists who'll say, well, you'll never get that, and say, well, but what if we did this? If we approached it from that angle, because these are kind of tricky discussions that we can't look at through just a humanitarian lens. So we've got to combine that humanitarian perspective with others. The other point on the cash question I thought was really good. It does need to be back on the agenda. I've heard as well that we've not got the results we want. And again, that's about connecting it to the Ukrainian government, about how do they see their safety nets working for their citizens. And again, so it's that connecting the humanitarian, and that's where states can really help out in terms of pushing those big, powerful actors within our sector, which include some of the biggest NGOs, as well as the UN agencies, and pushing those elephants in the room and saying, look, we need a change here. We need a different way of working. And they do need that nudge. As Ed said, often the incentives are internal, and they need that push from those with the money and the power to actually make those serious changes.
Many thanks, Gareth. Ed, would you like to comment also on this issue of should donor governments focus more on the political context, on the diplomacy side?
I'll pick up both. I'll also pick up, actually start with the cash coordination, because clearly, Gareth, I'm not sure you mentioned it, but in fact, the Interagency Standing Committee agreed on some sort of process. I mean, cash did not fit, was not a cluster, right? I mean, the clusters are the silos, and cash clearly cuts across, so to speak. So they came up with a different arrangement, which reminded me much more of what used to be the response to IDPs, internally displaced persons, years ago, the collaborative approach. I mean, whoever is best placed, it still leaves some kind of competition on the table, but at least there's a convener, OCHA, that brings the agencies, and it sort of then links to the context, whoever is best placed particularly, and on what, what's your comparative or competitive advantage, so to speak. What is interesting then is particularly the accountability question. Because obviously we all agree on the very positive effects or parts of cash, but there are also really serious questions in relation to cash and the use of cash. And so one that I came particularly across is the relation to protection, actually. And there, because we see there is of course a link between protection in the humanitarian domain and what is called social protection. So where does it get sensitive? It gets sensitive when governments who are particularly involved in the conflict in their country, so non-international armed conflict, demand beneficiary lists of organizations. Because those lists contain data, personal data, which you don't necessarily want to share with those authorities. Yet we need to find a way to include them, these people, into social safety nets. So at which point do you do that? When does a government become more your companion than they were perhaps before? At which stage in a transition process, so to speak, moving from a conflict to a more stable situation? I mean, those are really difficult questions, and there are huge accountability issues there in terms of, how you take decisions as organizations. And again, so what I'm saying is there is a need to explain your decision-making as an organization in a coordination body, because that's where you have to share your considerations and where the dialogue needs to happen. What we see way too less, or not enough, so to speak, is coordination actually, you know, so overlooking humanitarian principles, overlooking protection, overlooking accountability to affected people. It's about funding, it's about who does what. Instead, you know, it should focus much more on the values and principles underpinning humanitarian action. That was one that I wanted really to get off my chest.
Only a very quick final one, please.
On the other one, it's interesting because I think the donors really have a role to engage with agencies precisely on what is it that we're trying to achieve from a humanitarian point of view, so to speak. Because we sort of assume we're in the coordination room for the same reason. And I think that assumption needs to be tested. Because I can tell there's serious differences in terms of our considerations for being there. That is their role as donors. Interestingly, donors are not just donors, they're also governments. Their role as government precisely to engage on IHL and to bring that into the political domain, Security Council or elsewhere. So there is, for me, a separation also between the role of a donor and the role of a government.
For the sake of IHL, international humanitarian law. Sonja, I'm not sure which point you would like to comment on. Corinna indirectly touched also on the issue of staffing. Naming that 3 different cash focal points in such a central policy area Germany is dealing with might not help to move it. And we touched in our paper, which you will surely read tonight, as well on this point. So maybe that's something interesting to share, but make another point and I can raise it if you prefer.
Well, I think Deike Potzel already hinted on that, and I wouldn't... I think we laid that out in the paper and in the introduction. But I wanted to come back on the issue of incentives as well, because I think for the grand bargain, I don't want to be the defender of the grand bargain on this panel, but I think it tried at least to address this logic to some extent with this quid pro quo approach. So there was this idea of you get something and you invest something. So I think this was a good start, and apparently shifting the discussion towards efficiency and effectiveness also got us further than just always insisting on moral. So I think this is a very important learning. And I think if we talk about this very honestly, then we also need to bear in mind that, or be more honest in our conversations, that the humanitarian sector also follows a capitalist logic, and that when we talk about incentives, that this should also be taken into account. And then this changes, of course, also the way that you think about incentives such as the grand bargain. For example, we could put in place key performance indicators where country directors are measured by enhancing localization. This would certainly change things. Maybe a localization marker. I'm not sold on this, but maybe if it's done really well, this could change things. Indicators for overheads. And I mean, all these discussions take place within the grand bargain. And what I hear from the intermediary caucus, I think these were very honest conversations, necessary conversations, and difficult conversations. So, don't want to be defender, but also, don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And maybe on your point of cash coordination, Corinna, just sharing something from my research, it did make me very suspicious that no one that I talked to, neither the local actors, the UN actors, think tanks, etc., thought that there was something wrong with the outcomes, because everyone was really happy with the cash coordination caucus. That made me a little bit suspicious.
Deike Potzel, you have the final word. I might repeat what we discussed before on the staffing side, because you've been the deputy head of staffing in the German Foreign Office before. And one key point really coming back to us when we did our interviews, when we did the survey, etc., has been the issue of Germany only investing a fraction of stuff into humanitarian policies, as well as implementing the funding in terms of proportional, looking at it compared to other donors and comparable donors like Sweden. And another point is indeed the rapid rotation, people saying, well, you can't deal, talking about the Director General of the unit, it's very hard to deal with Germany if you have 3 in a row within a year, I believe, and of course it's the same on the working level. It would be an easy fix, so maybe giving that to you as a final point, but happy to comment on Kayu's point again, if you wish, or whatever you like.
Okay, no, well, yeah, happy to talk about staffing. I mean, in the foreign ministry as such, I think we would be very happy to have even more staff because everybody is like working really, really hard. So the workload is really very high. On the other hand, I mean, it's, you know, you don't get another 100 or 150 so easily. So you have to make do with what you have, and we have to really appreciate, or I really appreciate a lot, the hours that people put in. One also has to say that the huge increase in money and budget that we received over the last few years obviously sort of put more workload on the shoulder of our people. And as I say, it's not so easy to bring in so many new people so rapidly, so that's just not working. On the other hand, but this is getting a little bit technical, but we founded this BFRR, sort of another institution which was actually meant to take over a lot, and is actually taking over a lot of the work that was previously done, non-ministerial work, we call it, that was previously done in the foreign ministry. And this is how we lost quite a substantial number of people, but they also take over a lot of work. So yes, more people would be very welcome. On the other hand, we should not complain because we got more money and we have to handle more money per person now. I think everybody is still, all of my colleagues I know are very happy that they can use this money to help people on the ground. So they are seriously putting in a lot of work with a happy heart in a way, which is really amazing to see. So if any of the colleagues are watching online, and to those here in the audience, I see a few, it's also an opportunity for me to say thanks. And thank you for the great discussion.
Thank you for coming. We are proud that Foreign Office will be live, of course, on all screens. That's why they do so much overtime. Thank you for being here. Thanks, Gareth. A big thank you to Geneva. Many thanks for joining. I hope you had sufficient time to intervene, even hybrid. Many thanks, Ed, for coming and for coming to Berlin again. Many thanks, Sonja. And many thanks to the team. This has been a long day where we focused on macro policies of the Zeitenwende, in which ways a humanitarian turning point is needed in times of so many turning points and so many reforms. Tomorrow we will look into what this might mean in concrete terms. We will look into climate change and humanitarian change, into localization, what it might mean in this respect, in gender and in digitalization and humanitarian reform, looking into what we can learn from Ukraine, from all these crises we discussed already today. For now, it's time for dinner, if you can stay with us here on site. It's time for the DJ, who somewhere has put up everything, I hope. And so we thank you so much for having been here on site. We thank you so much online. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. And would be very grateful if you could join us tomorrow for any session. We restart at 9:30 Berlin time, CET, and so it would be great to have you with us once again. Thank you so much, and good night, goodbye.